All right, Braves fans, let's get rolling. I'm George McNair, and this is State of the Braves. Well, guys, for the second straight season, the Braves not only lost to the Philadelphia Phillies in 4 games in the NLDS, getting knocked out, but they also looked totally out of the series from the beginning. It is definitely an incredibly disappointing exit for the Braves for a second straight season. And, guys, just coming to you as a fan, I know what you're feeling. I'm feeling it too. It's just a terrible way to finish what was a great regular season, and it is also an all too familiar feeling for Braves fans. You don't want to get too fatalistic about things. We had a tremendous experience with the 2021 team winning the World Series. Hasn't been that long ago, so this is not a time for woe is us as Braves fans. That used to be a little more reasonable to say that, but it is still something, especially if you've been a Braves fan since the 90s. We've experienced this a lot, where you have a great regular season team that just simply peters out in the postseason. And unfortunately, I mean, you can make an argument that this is the most disappointing exit for any Braves team ever. I was thinking maybe Morgan Wallen might need to write a new song about the 2023 Braves as opposed to the 1998 Braves, because the 98 Braves at least made it through the wild card round to the NLCS. Well, guys, this could be a long episode. I just want to tell you that from the beginning. I have a lot of thoughts, and quite honestly, I'm processing through a lot of this disappointment and what happened with this series. So if you stick with me, that's great. I just want to tell you from the beginning that this one could go a little longer than usual, but I'll try not to drone on. Hopefully I can keep things topical and moving quickly as we go. But yeah, how does a team that won 104 games in the regular season, and not only that, was one of the greatest offenses in Major League history, and that's not hyperbole, right? All the stats back it up. One of the greatest offenses in Major League history. How does that team get beat by a team that they beat by 14 games in the regular season? At the end of the regular season, the Braves were 14 games better than the Philadelphia Phillies. But then we also were all probably feeling the same thing as they were entering this series, that the Phillies felt like a very dangerous team, not only from the experience that we had in 2022, but just the mentality that the Phillies play with, how difficult it is to play in Philadelphia. We knew these things going into this series, but you still just had a lot of confidence, especially in this offense, that they were going to match. And quite the opposite happened, right? The offense just totally falls flat. Braves fans know this situation well, unfortunately. Great regular season, and then the team falls flat in October. And why? And, we should have these answers, and I think we actually do. It's just a matter of, are the Braves as an organization willing to address them, right? Don't hide from the Braves' long history of, more often than not, falling flat in the postseason. I really hate the statement that the baseball playoffs are totally random, right? It's a random crapshoot. You just got to get into the dance, and every now and then you'll win one, but you can't put too much into losing. And I think that's just an excuse to ignore some fairly obvious things that are right in front of us. So again, what I'm going to try to do is analyze some of the reasons, some of the ways that the Braves were maybe set themselves up to not be successful this year. The simplest way to think about this is that the Braves were better constructed for the long haul of a regular season, while the Phillies were built better for the postseason. And I'm going to dive deeper into that later in this episode. But I think that is just a true statement, and it bears out, right? The Braves were way better in the regular season, 104 wins, but the Phillies take it to them again here in the postseason. Before we get into the rest of this episode, I just want to remind you guys how great the Braves were this season, and specifically how great their offense was. The Braves tied a major league record, which that goes back quite a long ways, over 100 years, right? The Braves tied a major league record with 307 home runs this year. They're the only team in modern major league history with a slugging percentage over 500. The top 5 guys in the lineup all had at least 33 home runs and at least 97 RBIs. Let's not forget Ronald Acuna's historic 40-70 season, which will likely conclude with an MVP award. Matt Olson led the majors by a long way in home runs and RBIs. The bottom of the order was historically good. It was better than many of the middle of the order lineups in baseball. The Braves had 6 position player all-stars this year in the All-Star game. And yet, of course, we all know that everything starts over when the postseason begins, right? So all of those accolades, all of those individual awards, all the things that they were able to do during the regular season, it matters, for history and the history books and all that. But for their postseason, it really doesn't, right? You start over from scratch. And obviously, for this short series, the Phillies offense was better than the Braves, as the Braves offense goes totally flat in the NLDS. So understanding how great they were in the regular season puts into perspective the disappointment of the NLDS against the Phillies. The Braves never had a 4-game stretch during the regular season in which they scored fewer than 9 runs. Not once this season did that happen, and yet in these 4 games against the Phillies, they scored 8 runs total. And when you watch the Braves at the plate, here's what I saw. I saw they weren't as patient at the plate. They were swinging at balls, and they were swinging at borderline strikes that they couldn't do much damage with. What that meant is they were either popping up or grounding out early in the count, oftentimes on the first pitch, or they were getting behind early, and that was leading to a few more strikeouts each game. Their timing was off, and I think this had something to do with the long layoff, and I'll get to that in a little bit. I'm not going to blame this failure entirely on the layoff. I do think it was a factor, but they were behind on fastballs all season or all series long, and they were in front of breaking balls, right? It's that classic, your timing and your mentality at the plate is just a little off. No one was going up the middle. No one was really going the opposite field. I mean, you saw it occasionally, but generally speaking, what we saw all season just was not there. A couple other numbers, like really basic numbers to back up the shift that happened with the Braves offense compared to the regular season. So the Braves strikeouts per game in the regular season was just under 8. For the NLDS, it was up to 8.5. Now, that's not a huge change. I will say they didn't strike out much in Game 4. Ranger Suarez pitched that game, and he's not a big strikeout guy. So the strikeout was not the main issue in the final game of the series, but it was definitely up quite a bit in the first 3 games. Walks per game for the season, the Braves had 3.31 walks per game, and in the NLDS, it was down to 2.75. Hits per game, the Braves during the regular season were the best team in baseball at hits per game at 9.44. It went all the way down to 6 hits per game during this series with the Phillies. And then maybe the starkest number, and this is the one that was just very obvious to me before I ever went to the numbers, hard hit rate. The Braves hit the ball harder than any team, and they hit it more consistently hard than any team in baseball during the regular season. A 38.3 hard hit percentage. Hard hit means basically you're hitting it at 95 miles per hour or harder when you make contact with the baseball and put it in play. In the NLDS, their hard hit rate was down a full 10%, 28.4%, which is the lowest of any team in the NLDS. The Phillies had the second highest hard hit rate of any team in the NLDS. So just very stark numbers there. The bottom of the order definitely vanished for the Braves. RC ended up going 2 for 13 with just 1 RBI and no extra base hits in the series. Michael Harris 0 for 13, absolutely nothing offensively. I will shout out Harris for 2 tremendous defensive plays, but the offense simply was not there from those 2 guys. And then very little from Acuna, Olsen, and Ozuna. Acuna only goes 2 for 14, no home runs, no RBIs. Olsen 4 for 16, which is not terrible, but no extra base hits, no RBIs. And Ozuna 2 for 13, no extra base hits, no RBIs. And those 3 guys are very obviously vital to your offense. So they just were non-existent for as great as they were in the regular season. So why did this team play so below its abilities? I see 3 big underlying factors, all of which honestly were weaknesses for the Braves and strengths for the Phillies in this series. And I think these are things that the Braves are going to have to figure out long term, right? This is not just a one-off kind of thing that happened for this series. So let me list all 3 of them, and then obviously I'm going to dive into each of these 3 more in depth. So the first one is the regular season versus postseason mentality, and how those things are very different. And the Braves over the years, even since Bobby Cox days, have seemed to treat the postseason just like the regular season. The second issue is the makeup of the clubhouse. And so this has nothing to do with talent level. Okay, this has to do with kind of the personality of guys in the clubhouse and the way that they tackle playoff games, basically. And then the third thing is I do want to address the long layoff disadvantage that is, I think, definitely something worth discussing a little bit more. I discussed it last podcast. Again, I don't think it's the primary issue, but I think it absolutely had something to do with the disappointment in this series and last year as well. All right, so the regular season versus postseason mentality. So since Bobby Cox, right, what has made the Braves a dominant regular season team that wins divisions like almost every year, right? Every year that they have a good team in place, they seem to win the division. And yet that is the same thing that holds them back in the playoffs, right? So it's just this philosophy, this mentality that they take to the regular season does not translate well to postseason success. All right. So such as, right, things such as play every game the same way with the same approach, right? Take each day by day and play each game the same way. Don't get too high or too low. Keep your emotions kind of flat. If a player is struggling, this is more in like the managerial aspect of it. If a player is struggling, let them work it out. Trust your players, right? Let them kind of struggle through and get better and figure things out. Win your division early. Take your foot off the gas and then try to ramp up for the playoffs, right? All of these things happened under Bobby Cox year after year, and only in 1995 were they able to win a World Series. But this doesn't work with the playoffs, right? The playoffs are different. They can't be managed the same way as regular season games, and players should not treat postseason games the same way that they treat regular season games. You know, in the regular season for baseball, there's 162 games. You cannot possibly mentally or emotionally treat every game like it's do or die. You can't possibly manage every game like it's do or die, right? You have to play the long game to win a division. But it has to flip in the postseason, right? Mentally, emotionally, you do have to be all in. You have to be more invested and have that sense of urgency. A manager should be managing differently. I mean, thinking of course, the elder pitching Bryce Elder, right? I think this is the best example of where Snitker is very much following the Bobby Cox approach of baseball. He decides that he's going to pitch Bryce Elder in Game 3. Number one, just that decision tells you a lot, right? He's going to trust his guy that has been out there every fifth day for the entire regular season. Even though Bryce Elder has struggled mightily since the All-Star break, he's going to trust his guy to go out there and do the job, even though it seems pretty obvious to most of us that this is not the best thing to do to win a playoff game. Okay, so just that decision is part of it. And then when Elder's out there trusting him to pitch to Bryce Harper with first and third, 2 outs, and Elder has not shown good command throughout all of this stretch of bad baseball that he's pitched, and he hangs a slider right down the middle that Harper absolutely annihilates for a 3-run homer. And that was the turnaround of that game, and it was one of the big moments for the entire series, maybe the moment of the entire series that really flipped it on its head. So just a perfect example of the flaw in which most managers would have either walked Harper, even though the open base is second base, walk Harper and go for a righty-righty matchup against somebody other than one of the best players in baseball. Or they might have taken Elder out, right? Go with a lefty. Bring in Brad Hand early in the game or whoever, and try to get out of that situation and then figure it out from there. But instead, Snitker sticks with his guy. Every moment in the playoffs is crucial, and especially moments like the one where Harper hits the 3-run homer. You can't play the long game. You can't have that same mentality of, oh, we'll get them tomorrow. That regular season mindset. Trusting your player in that moment doesn't do the team any good. In the middle of the regular season, allowing Elder to pitch to Harper like that, it does the team some good, right? Because if Elder is able to get out of it, great. And if not, it's a learning experience that he can move on from. But in the playoffs, it just buries your team. So again, guys, that first point that I want to make, just that regular season mentality versus postseason mentality. Us Braves fans know it for a long time, and it's been an issue for a long time that it seems like, and again, not disrespecting Bobby Cox. I love him. He is a Hall of Fame manager, but it was always very obviously his weak point, and it was a big reason why the Braves only won one World Series during his tenure. And Snitker is very much a disciple of Bobby Cox. They treat these things the same way. They have very much that same philosophy. And look, it gets you in the dance, right? It tends to get you to the playoffs a lot, but I do think it also puts you behind certain teams in the way that they play with just such urgency that the Braves don't seem to play with in the playoffs. All right, guys, the next thing I want to talk about is the personnel makeup for the Braves. This is the second thing that I think stands in the way, a little bit at least, maybe more than a little bit if I'm being honest, for the Braves really being successful in the playoffs. Again, it's very easy when you watch the Braves versus the Phillies to see that these clubhouses are night and day different. And everybody knows that the Braves tend to be probably the most professional businessman type of team in baseball. That's probably their overarching culture, let's say. Okay, but I think there's actually two main groups that dominate the Braves clubhouse, and I don't know that any one group should dominate a team's clubhouse culture. I think the best situation is where you have a balance of multiple types of player. But anyways, let me get into the two main groups that I think dominate the Braves clubhouse currently. So the first is that straight lace, lunch pail businessman type of player who's going to show up every day. He's a solid dude, right? He works hard. He has a good attitude. He has high character, which I think most of the Braves have high character. But these guys particularly that I think about on the Braves it's Austin Riley, it's Matt Olson, Sean Murphy, Travis d'Arnaud, Charlie Morton. There's others, but those are like some of the big names that stuck out to me. And so, this group very much falls in line with the Bobby Cox, Brian Snitker approach, right? They're not going to get too high. They're not going to get too low. This is this group is incredibly crucial for regular season success and really just that consistency of effort and play and all those things. So they're a really important group that you need, right? This is not a negative or a slight on them at all. But you need more than this in a clubhouse. Okay. So maybe these are your foundational pieces, right? But it's not all that you need. This is the Braves way, right? Bobby Cox, Brian Snitker, and old Braves like I think Tom Glavine, John Smoltz, Chipper, Freddie, Dansby, they all emulated this type of player. Most of the current Braves coaching staff, of course, falls into this group as well, and they will encourage this type of a player, and it represents the Braves culture, I think, more than any other. Okay, so that's probably the most dominant group that exists for the Braves clubhouse. But you have a second group that I would call the happy-go-lucky, just have fun group. And the three guys that stand out to me more than anybody else on the team would be Ozuna, Acuna, and Arcia. Okay, so again, happy-go-lucky, they're always having fun, and the fact is this group has a hard time locking in big games because they thrive on being loose and having fun at all times, right? To tighten up would constrict them and make them probably less productive, especially during the regular season. But there's a problem with this, right? Because in the postseason, things do get more serious and they do tighten up. And I think generally, not always, but generally, this group has a hard time taking responsibility for failure, right? And that's one reason it's kind of like a coping mechanism is you're always having fun and you're always smiling and laughing and loose. It's just a way to deal with pressure. And but sometimes you can't run away from the pressure in October. And unfortunately, might know where I'm leading with this, guys, but Ronald Acuna leaving leaving his locker after losing and not taking questions after the game, I think is indicative of this. It's certainly indicative of, let's be honest, it's a representation of not taking responsibility and some immaturity. And I wish Ronald would have overcome some of this by now. I think he has overcome a lot of immaturities. And I think that's one reason why he had such a great MVP type of season. But this certainly is not a great way to end his season. He is the best player on the planet. But behavior like this does impact the clubhouse, right? Every other teammate stood there and took questions, hard questions, in the middle of huge disappointment. They stayed and had to deal with, national media who aren't as kind or nice to you as local media. And, each of those guys stood there and took responsibility for being upset in this series. And Ronald dipped out. I mean, he just did. And, it is disappointing he do that. I don't like it. And I do think there are impacts to the clubhouse. I don't know how the Braves will handle this long term, but obviously this type of behavior very much goes against the overall Braves way, or the way that most of the Braves are encouraging players to act. There were, stories, and maybe it was just rumors, but there were stories that Ronald and Freddie Freeman over the years had some tense moments because of this, right? It's a very different way of dealing with and playing the game. And so, again, I put Ozuna, Acuna, and Arcia kind of in the middle of this group. I think Arcia is another good example, and right now I'm going to bring up the the incident with Bryce Harper, right? The attaboy Bryce incident where, Arceus apparently said, attaboy Bryce, kind of making fun of Bryce Harper after the Braves won game 2. I'm sure you guys are kind of aware of this and it blowing up in the media. And, I think it's pretty dumb, honestly, that this even became a big story. But you need to have the fire to stand up to your opponent when it's suddenly no longer fun and games and things get real. right? So, okay, Arcia said it. He wasn't saying it to Harper. It was said in the clubhouse and it got out, and yet he said it. And what I wish had happened, I wish Arcia had taken responsibility for saying it and then stood toe to toe and, even gone after Harper a little bit. But that's not what happened. So I have no issue, by the way. I have no issue with Arcia saying this in the clubhouse. He was celebrating this amazing game 2 win. And I think it's actually kind of classless for the reporter to make a controversy out of what Arcia said. But to me, that's the secondary part of the story. The big part of this story was how Harper and Arcia both reacted and handled this situation. So Harper, I'm no big fan of Bryce Harper for any, that's an understatement. But Bryce Harper goes Michael Jordan on this situation, right? If you saw the Bulls documentary, you know that Michael Jordan would take any little slight that anybody would ever say, and he would use that as motivation, and it would help him to perform. And I think that's exactly what Bryce Harper did here. This is a small, insignificant slight from Arcia, and Harper used it to motivate himself. I think it's dumb to do that. I think it's petty, but it worked. It obviously worked for Harper. Okay, but from a Braves standpoint, how does Arcia deal with this? And how do the Braves, as a clubhouse, deal with it, right? Harper hits that home run off of Elder, and he is staring down Arcia at second base. Everybody saw that. It's very obvious. What does Arcia do? What do the Braves do? They don't do anything, right? They just shrink away. I mean, they just don't do anything. And look, I'm never really an advocate for fighting, but I think if Arcia had had tackled Bryce Harper in that moment, I mean, he gets thrown out of the game. It would be melee. But Harper was clearly exerting dominance over Arcia, right? This is like prime. This is a total alpha move, right? It's an alpha move. I'm going to dominate you. I'm going to step on your throat. I'm going to embarrass you. I'm going to prove to you that I'm the stronger guy, whatever you want to call it. That's exactly what Harper was doing. And Arcia just stood there and took it. And I think if Arcia or even another Brave had stood in, for him and taken Harper on, I think it probably, just from an emotional standpoint, would have totally turned the series around. I don't know for certain that the Braves would have won the series at that point, but I think at the very least, it would have said a lot to, we're standing toe-to-toe with you guys, and we are not backing down. But that's not what happened. To me, one of the great Braves moments that I remember is when Brian McCann stood toe-to-toe with, I think it was Gomez for the Brewers. So you guys are going to remember that, where Gomez hits a home run, and he's jawing at basically every Brave going around the bases. And Brian McCann was having none of it, right? He stood in front of home plate, didn't even let Gomez touch home plate from that home run. That you needed something like that in that moment. And I really wish that Arcia or one of the other Braves would have done that, but particularly Arcia to stand up for himself. So, what connection am I making to this and this whole idea that some of these guys are just these happy-go-lucky, just have fun guys? Well, in the playoffs, that doesn't work. Sometimes that doesn't work, right? You get into these really tense, heated interactions and moments, and it's time to get serious. And it's time to stand up for yourself and for your teammates. And that just did not happen. And I think this is just proof of it. So, both of these groups, the very, straight-laced businessman kind of group and the let's just have fun group, both of these groups are very helpful for the regular season, right? Keep you loose, that sort of thing. Don't get too high or get too low. But both of these groups have a hard time getting up for the playoffs, right? At least on their own, they have a hard time, getting fired up for the playoffs. All right, so this doesn't mean that these guys don't care, right? It doesn't mean that they don't have fire or that they are not like fully invested in the team. I know that they all are. But again, this is about how they treat pressure in the big moment. And I would suggest that the Braves clubhouse is basically dominated mostly by these two groups. Now, there are three other groups I'm going to say exist in the Braves clubhouse, okay? The third group is kind of the middle guys. And they do serve an important role on the team, and these are the glue guys. And these guys can kind of float between all the different groups. And I would say Ozzie Albies and Michael Harris probably fit in here, right? You'll see Ozzie, having fun with this, this other group that just loves to have fun all the time. But he can also be serious and straight-laced and very much focused in on the moment, like Riley and Olsen can be. And then Michael Harris, I think, is very much the same way. And these guys are important because they kind of bring all the different groups together for cohesion. So you need these guys, and I think the Braves do have two really good guys in Ozzie and Michael Harris. Two other groups, however, that I think are underrepresented on the Braves, and this is the bigger point that I'm trying to get to, is that the Braves are weak in these two areas, and they need more guys who fit into these two groups on the team. All right, the first group is the quiet competitors. Okay, these guys, even though they're not, super like in your face, their fire burns very deep, and you usually see them step up more in the playoffs. And I would put Max Fried and Eddie Rosario particularly in this group. Okay, so this group tends to lock in more in the big moments, but because they're not loud and in your face, I don't think they influence the larger group and the clubhouse all that much. But they do perform tremendously in the big moments. And of course, we've seen Eddie Rosario do that. One of my disappointments from this series with the Phillies is that Rosario was he didn't play much, and a lot of that was because of all the lefties that the Phillies had. I do wish that Snitker just would have put him in a little bit more against a couple lefties just to give him at bats and give him a chance to break through. But and then we've seen Fried, pitch great in big moments too. He didn't pitch super great in this series, but of course he hadn't pitched in a long time. So, anyways, I think I also try to connect this to some Braves of the past. I think Soler fit into this group as well, right? He raised his game in the playoffs, but was a pretty quiet guy. I think Fred McGriff fit into this for the Braves. Relatively just quiet guy, but he always played really great in the playoffs for the Braves. So you need those guys who, of course, are going to perform and are going to lock in even more in big moments. And then this last piece is where I think the Braves are particularly lacking, and that is the cocky, fiery competitor, or you could call this the Jock Peterson type, right? I think it's been one of Anthopoulos' biggest failures. Maybe failures a big word, but mistakes of not bringing Jock Peterson back. And it's not just about Jock. I mean, there are other guys in baseball that kind of fit in this area. The two guys that I think probably do fit for the Braves that are on the team right now are Spencer Strider and AJ Minter. I think these two guys are bulldogs. They are a little more fiery and outwardly aggressive and in your face and that kind of that kind of competitor. But certainly we know Jock Peterson was, and he brought a lot of edge to that 2021 team, and I think that was a huge part of the Braves winning that season. So this group tends to perform well in pressure games, but also has a positive influence on the group externally because they exude confidence outwardly to the team, right? And I just think the Braves are really lacking in that area. And one thing you might notice, I put Strider and Minter in this group, but those two guys are pitchers. And I think the Braves probably don't have one regular position player in this group that's on the team currently. When I think of 2021, I already mentioned Jock Peterson, but I think Tyler Matzik also for the bullpen fit into this too. I mean, Matzik is definitely in your face and fiery as well. So that 2021 team, again, it just had a lot more of these other two types of players. And I think the current team is lacking in those areas. So just kind of a quick summary of what I just said, guys. I think there's a little bit of an off-kilter thing going on in the Braves clubhouse right now. It's not that I think they all get along. I don't think there's any major, squabbles or disagreements or anything like that conflict in the clubhouse. But I think you need some more fire and some guys who are going to raise their game in the postseason. And we just certainly didn't have that in 2023. All right, the third big thing that I think affected this team was the long layoff disadvantage. Now, again, and I'm going to lean on a Spencer Strider quote here near the end of the episode, but I really don't want to use this as the primary excuse for why the Braves lost. I do think it's legitimate to talk about it. Strider, in fact, will say that he doesn't want to use that as an excuse at all, which I appreciate as a player, but I think from the outside looking in, we can look at this long layoff as a disadvantage for the teams that got the bye. I mean, 1 out of 3 teams made it to the NLCS. And just when you look at the Braves, right, the eye test, everyone looked slow on the fastball and early on the off speed. Their timing was off. And in comparison, Philly was locked in. I mean, Castellanos hitting Strider's 100-mile-an-hour fastball out in the last game, I think is perfect evidence that Philly was totally locked in a way that the Braves were not. And then, look no further than Ozuna and Harris and Olsen and Acuna all struggling with the bat. Guys, at the end of the season, all 4 of those guys were just red hot with the bat. And suddenly, 5 days off, and they're all off, right? The timing's off. And baseball, especially hitting, is all about timing, and that timing was taken away. The three teams that got bounced, so I'm particularly looking at the offense, right? In a very simple way, the 3 teams that got bounced that won 100 games. The Dodgers scored 2 runs per game in their 3 games. The Orioles scored 3.67 runs per game. They had 1 outburst in 1 game. They still lost that game because they pitched really poorly. And then the Braves scored 2 runs per game, right? The offense was not there for anybody. For the Dodgers, Freddie Freeman and Mookie Betts went a combined 1 for 21, and that 1 hit was a Freddie Freeman infield single. So, some of the best hitters in baseball, you give them 5 days off, they're just not going to perform at the same level. It's just as simple as that. So it does beg the question, however, why were the Astros able to advance, and why have they had so much continued postseason success? Of course, not including the cheating years. I'm looking at after they cheated, they have been able to continue postseason success. And look, I think there are probably a couple things different. I think the Astros probably do play and manage with a greater sense of urgency for each game. I think obviously they have a different clubhouse than the Braves, and they might have a few more guys with that fiery attitude that I'm really hoping the Braves are able to add. I'd love to know how they treated the long layoff differently. I don't know the specifics of what they did compared to the Braves. Of course, the Braves tried this inter-squad, 3 inter-squad games. But I really wonder if they were still just, loose and not really taking them seriously. I just wonder what those inter-squad games looked like. And obviously, it didn't work very well. So the Astros must have been doing something differently. And, the Astros did have to play all the way up to the end of the season to make the playoffs and to get that bye. And so they probably were a little more locked in than the Braves were at the very end of the season. And, of course, I think the last thing is that the Braves had to play Philly. I think that was the toughest draw of any team in the NLDS, not just because Philly had the postseason experience from last year, but playing in Philadelphia is incredibly challenging. The Braves certainly experienced that. So, all right, the next thing I want to talk about is why, what was different in 2021, right? Why did the Braves have postseason success that year? Why did the Braves win in that year, but have failed in the last 2 seasons? So specifically in 2021, the Braves got to start with a less challenging opponent in the playoffs. I mean, they just got a better draw, and that's true, right? They had to play the Brewers. The Brewers were a good team. They had a good pitching staff. but they were a fairly weak offense. And playing in Milwaukee isn't exactly the same intensity as playing in Philadelphia. You might remember the Braves actually dropped the very first game of that series and then went on to win the next three. They shut down Milwaukee. I think they won game 2 and game 3, both 3-0, right? They were able to shut them out for 2 games. So yeah, it was a different matchup that I think favored the Braves a lot more. I can't stand the Phillies, right? I think a lot of their players, I'm just being honest, I just think a lot of their players are jerks. You might have seen the Castellanos interview after they won. It just they do come across that way. Maybe they're trying to, maybe they don't care. But that being said, they have a lot of dudes who have edge, right? They have more guys in that Jock Peterson sphere than the Braves do, and I think that is to their advantage. And then their fans are 100% in at all times, basically standing the entire game, just literally on every pitch. And that's not to put down Braves fans. I mean, I think there's a huge difference between fans in the Northeast and fans in the Southeast, right? We know if you're from the South, right, it's just a different way, and you're going to be more chill and more relaxed, and I like that a lot better. Um, but that is just the reality. And by the way, I also can't stand Phillies fans. Okay, they are mocking the opponent. It seems like more often they're mocking the opponent than they're actually rooting for their own team. We know that Phillies fans are notorious for booing Santa Claus. Yeah, I just wish, just go root for your own team. Don't mock the other team. But that's just me personally. I don't do that. I wouldn't do that. But it's frustrating to watch, but it's still something that the Braves should embrace as like a huge challenge and go in there and, shut them up and win. So they weren't able to do that, obviously, but it does make for just a different level of challenge to play the Phillies in a short 5-game series. And then on top of all of that, the challenge to play the Phillies is the Phillies had huge motivation coming into this game, right? Probably more than any other team in the National League would have to beat the Braves. The Braves, don't forget, clinched the NL East on the Phillies field and took it to them all year. So all of that it just made it a really challenging first round. So I think that's one thing that was different compared to 2021. The second thing that was different is something I already talked about, and that's the Jock Peterson factor, right? The Braves had a swagger in 2021, and they had those guys who just played better and raised their game in October. And I think that's probably the biggest difference in the 2023 team and the 2021 team, right? The 2023 team is clearly a better regular season team. They were historically great in the regular season, but fell flat in the postseason. The 2021 team didn't even win 90 games, and yet they ran through the postseason. That team never even got to an elimination game, right? They really dominated in a lot of ways throughout the entire postseason before they won it. So just very different. If you think about on the field, who came up the biggest for the Braves throughout that postseason, right? Jock Peterson had massive home runs against the Brewers. Eddie Rosario and Tyler Matzik, right? Their performances, legendary performances against the Dodgers. Soler and Fried against the Astros. So all of these guys are fitting into those, really fiery two tiers, right? Two categories that I talked about earlier. And of course, the Braves, not all those guys are on the Braves team anymore, right? We lost Jock. Matzik was down with injury. We lost Soler. And so it's going to be interesting to see if Anthopoulos figures out a way to replace those guys with some guys that are similar. The other thing that the Braves had going for them in 2021 is a healthier pitching staff. It just did not fall right these last 2 years going into the postseason. Pitching was not the main issue against the Phillies, but I do think that game 3 of not having Charlie Morton, obviously if Morton is healthy and goes out and shuts down the Phillies and the Braves win game 3, it's a very different situation for the Braves. They, at the very least, get the series back to Atlanta, and things might turn out different. but yeah, the Braves had a healthier pitching staff going into the postseason in 2021. Don't forget how huge Ian Anderson was throughout the 2021 postseason. It's easy to forget about because he's been absent for a while. And then Charlie Morton was really big. He got hurt, but that wasn't until the World Series, and he was really big through those first two series also. Looking at that, I do think, and I'm going to talk about, I'm going to have obviously other episodes where I talk about what the Braves need to do in the offseason, but just a short little point. I do think the Braves need a solid veteran pitcher next year, whether or not Charlie Morton exercises his option and comes back for one final year. But I think it's kind of obvious that the Braves need someone that they can just lean and rely on for the postseason. So, guys, those things are all, I think, all just accurate. But the good news is the Braves have assembled the most talented, the deepest roster in baseball. It's a roster full of good dudes, and I appreciate how these guys stood up and took responsibility for coming up short. Strider's quote. I'm going to get to his larger quote in a minute, but he basically said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, he took ownership of hanging a few sliders and saying that he needs to be better, and I appreciate that. It wasn't his fault the Braves lost this series, but there he is along with, Olsen and Riley and all those guys just taking responsibility for what was obviously a very disappointing exit. You just appreciate those guys stepping up and taking responsibility. And again, Ronald should have been there. He should have been doing that. And it's hard, in such an emotional moment, but it's what you should do. And I really hope that this is another moment of growth for Ronald to realize he kind of let his teammates down and comes back and is an even better version of himself next year. So all this to be said, right? How Anthopoulos and Snitker adjust their philosophy and the clubhouse for next season is probably going to be the story of the offseason. The first thing I think they should do is bring in a few guys with that Jock Peterson edge. Maybe it's not Jock himself. I don't know if Jock himself would be the answer, but guys like that who just have an edge about them, who have a cockiness about them, and are going to remind the rest of the clubhouse how good they actually are, and that they shouldn't back down to any team. Certainly, they shouldn't back down to the Phillies. And then the other thing that they have to do, and this is more on Snitker, is change how you approach the playoffs. So I want to go now to a Spencer Strider quote, just in relation to this need to change the approach to the playoffs. Strider said, "It's disappointing. We're not a group that makes excuses. I'm not a person who makes excuses. I'm sure there are a lot of Braves fans that aren't happy and that they have every right to be. I think the people trying to use the playoff format to make an excuse for the results they don't like are not confronting the real issue. You're in control of your focus, your competitiveness, your energy. And if having 5 days off, if you can't make that adjustment, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. I think we focused and competed very well, but we obviously need to find some adjustments and make them. But this is not a team I would bet against if I were the rest of the world." I cut that quote kind of in the middle there, but that's basically what he said. And I really appreciate Strider. He's incredibly thoughtful. And I think this is totally true, right? Two things I love about this quote. Player responsibility, right? Each player needs to take responsibility to be physically and mentally ready for the playoffs. And then number two, the team as a whole needs to adjust how they prep for the playoffs. Change is needed in how they do that. And yeah, I mean, just both of those things are true. And, maybe there were certain players who weren't mentally and physically ready for the playoffs. I certainly think that showed up, but I just think it's exactly what needs to be said in that moment. So guys, the Braves are good enough to make the postseason every year for the foreseeable future, but you have to figure out how to overcome this very obvious problem of playing better and being more prepared to win in the playoffs. If they want to win another World Series, they're going to have to overcome this issue. So, guys, in episodes to come, I will give my own opinions on what the Braves should be doing this offseason to do just these things, right, to address these issues. So, guys, it's not fun to do an episode of the Braves losing and being knocked out. I'm sure you've had your own frustrations about it, but it's okay. The Braves are in a way better long-term situation than pretty much any other team in baseball. And I know Braves fans are going to continue to support this team. And I just hope that 2024 can end a little better than 2023. And I wish the offseason wasn't already here for Braves fans, but we're here and we'll be okay. And I know the Braves are going to bounce back and hopefully bounce back in a big way, just like Spencer Strider was saying. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate y'all listening and watching, and I will talk to you soon.